Hey everybody, it's Tom, and today I'm going to discuss the word socialism. And this is the second episode of a series in which I'm trying to take terms that are integral to the public discourse, but which, despite that circumstance, are often employed in vague, sometimes contradictory manners, and as a consequence often become stumbling blocks to forward motion. And certainly socialism presents itself as among the more salient of these kinds of words, notions, concepts, ideas. Now, really, my impression in the general American conversation, though things have improved in some respects over the past few years on this count, is that socialism is conceived as a commitment to using the apparatus of the state or the government to intervene in the market, and when it's being read charitably, intervene in the market in a way which constrains the excesses of the market, which are generally acknowledged even by the most ardent of free market advocates. Now, I'm not going to say this is completely off the mark, but what it does is attempt, one, to hold socialism as either a mode of economy or a mode of political relationship with the economy or a mode of government. Wherever you put the weight, what is perhaps lost in that connection is that socialism really cannot be reduced to a form of economy or government or a relationship between those terms, because it is instead something which transcends a particular institutional or economic arrangement. It is the notion that the decisions we make as a society should be subordinate to the good of everyone in that society. Now, obviously, because of the tension between our identity as an individual and our identity as part of a social fabric, this doesn't represent an easy order. It's perhaps among the tallest orders because it involves also navigating the tension between those terms. But at all events, it is insistent, socialism, that we cannot allow the logic which is internal to a subordinate arrangement or component or portion of society to overtake our view of the whole. And thus, when we turn to specific aspects or dimensions of social engagement, like the economy, like politics, like culture, the socialist commitment is going to have definite implications. This has, in over the last century or 2 centuries, 3 centuries really, often unfolded in terms of how we relate with the economy and how the apparatus of the state can be used as part of that conversation conversation, obviously not historically the best word at certain moments in that process, but because there's serious tensions and conflicts which accompany that history. But we want to stay on point with the definition here. Nevertheless, it should be remarked that as part of that definition, in virtue of this historical association with contest over how we organize economic decisions, it's often tied into a sort of staging of historical development, which is inherited largely from the Marxist tradition, where history itself is conceived as the unfolding of class conflict, where a minority exercises, in one way or another, inordinate control over the resources of a society and exploits those or that control to dominate and control the remainder. And this, for example, finds clear exposition in feudalism. And what is sanguine about the emergence of capitalism over the course of, let's say the late 15th through, present day, late 15th century to the present day. And of course, these sorts of datings are always approximate, is that it did enable a re-articulation of how our social relations are determined that went beyond the fixity of self-conception which was present under the feudal dispensation. To be careful, because things have never been monochromatic, and it's very tempting to accept a sort of almost a romantic conception of the medieval era as a homogeneous one where everything was crisply delineated and meted out, those who work, or those who farm, those who pray, and those who fight, and that sort of thing. But in fact, even within the medieval context, there's all sorts of struggle and peasant uprisings and so forth. So this tension, this acuity, even if it wasn't put in the terms which we might put it today, was present even at that time. But even though capitalism in many ways represents movement forward beyond the iniquities of the feudal framework, it introduces a new and different set of iniquities. Some of them even more pernicious or insidious, because rather than being connected strictly to a single set of individuals, it's tied to frameworks and institutions and decentered in a way that makes it difficult for us to confront in a forward or an obvious manner how they arise in the first place. And it is in virtue of the fact that capitalism in various ways underwrites these iniquitous structures that socialism will often conceive of itself as having an uneasy and often outrightly antagonistic relationship with capitalism. And I talked a little bit about that in the video from, it was yesterday, on capitalism. To elaborate on that somewhat at this junction, is an important addition to be made to what could be considered the relatively obvious moral consideration that a socialist might bring to bear vis-a-vis the capitalist framework. We're going to abstract from that for the second and look at two other features of that framework which for the socialist seem to themselves in almost antithetical relationship with the principle that the decisions that we're making in terms of allocating resources are decisions which we're making with an eye to the good of the society as a whole. And those two features of capitalism, which I would like to demarcate, are the fashion in which, with respect to what is driving the decision as to what is going to be produced and how it's going to be produced, is, as we mentioned the other day, simply the notion of surplus value. Colloquially, or how it's often put in sort of more conventionally accepted economic conversations, this is the idea of growth. Growth is the imperative. Full stop. The growth then is not bounded by any respect or deference to what the concrete circumstances are which we face as individuals or as a society. The parade example of how this comes across and has obviously damning implications is how when you look at a figure like GOP, no, not GOP, there's a Freudian slip, right? GDP or GNP, the gross domestic or gross national product. Oftentimes, when a catastrophe of immense proportion happens, say in the case of Hurricane Katrina vis-a-vis New Orleans, or Fukushima in the case of Japan, the incident actually provokes a growth in GOP, meaning that from a certain vantage is actually positive for the economy, even though obviously the disaster is positively a negative, or very largely a negative, for human society as a whole. So that's one consequence of assuming growth value as your overarching consideration without deference to concrete circumstance, is that it invites us to pursue a dynamic which is internally indifferent to what is positively occurring, and you can't even really fault the dynamic. It's it has the aspect of an inert machine. It's our willing submission to that mindlessness, which is the problem. And the other aspect, which is intimately related, is that that was sort of like I'm putting that there kind of negatively, but more positively, what are we actually going to do with our resources? What are we going to actually create? Well, when you don't have a unifying sensibility, there is no coordination. And then you have a proliferation of all sorts of superfluous and ridiculous productions, so, you've got people who will, have thousands of pairs of shoes, okay, or 17 automobiles, okay, and, or you have this enormous, I hate to use the word proliferation again, but proliferation of disposable cups and paper and so forth, and all sorts of things like that, which are produced, or who makes all those toys they put in the little 25-cent machines that you see oftentimes in the vestibule of grocery stores, these cheap little plastic inanities, right? This is overproduction, the crisis of overproduction, and it has severe consequences, obviously severe consequences for the environment, but also when you have to stop and think, what are we doing with our lives? That this is where we as a society are investing our energy in the multiplication and over multiplication of mindlessly produced luxuries or conveniences. And that's not to say it's all bad. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But on the other hand, in virtue of that, we've lost touch with a vision of longer arc. We're actually in a situation of grave concern with reference to how we relate with each other in the world, how we relate to the environment, and all the rest of it. And so when someone says they're a socialist, their concern is not principally with using the state to cordon off the market. That is a possible tactic which can be employed, and there's lots of complicated questions associated with that. But being a socialist is more than assuming a tactic. It's embracing a broader vision that takes into account the good of society as a whole, both for today, tomorrow, and to borrow from the tradition of the indigenous Americans, the seventh generation and beyond. So much by way of discussing socialism, and I hope that helps clarify the matter somewhat. Tomorrow, take up another topic which has been mentioned and has been implicit in this overview of capitalism, socialism, and that's the topic of class. What is class? How does it play into what's happening in the world today? I'll leave it like that for now, and thank you so much for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Ciao.